What matters are the fears and thoughts we usually keep hidden. Disordinati is where people strip back the layers.
Okay, welcome everyone to the Disordinati podcast. I'm here today with a wonderful guest, Dr. Nelly Ben Hayoun-Stépanian. I hope I pronounced it correctly. Artist, filmmaker, founder of the International Space Orchestra, which I think is super cool. It's the world's first orchestra of space scientists. You've also launched art to the International Space Station. You've sent Armenian pomegranate seeds into orbit, and you challenge the politics of who space is really for. And one of your latest projects is this amazing movie, Doppelgängers, which explores queer identity, trauma, and the future of this space exploration. So I want to start with the space. So you've described space as political. What do most people misunderstand about space exploration today? What is space to you?
I don't think people misunderstand what space is, but I think the issue we have at this point in time in history is 99% of the media space is being monopolized by, figures like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos, which are this kind of patriarchal, colonialist and imperialistic kind of visions for outer space, in which, for example, just to kind of like reiterate what their visions are, Jeff Bezos is planning on taking all the dump that we have on planet Earth and literally taking it in on the moon. So you kind of, for him, it's like a direct solution to all the sustainable problem that we have. Is just let's take all of the manufacture from Earth and just bring it into outer space. So at least we don't have to deal with all the damages that it causes. So that's one vision. And then the other vision, which is the one of Elon Musk, is the one of the multiplanetary species, which is the idea of like sending a colony, on the moon, and then eventually this colony is going to allow us, kind of a pass towards, Mars, and then we kind of drop colonies and colonies and colonies and kind of keep on populating other planets as humans, as a species. And these are the two visions that kind of getting a lot of space and energy in a way. And that's probably the ones that you have heard of. And maybe, like younger people, when they come and they think about space, that's kind of like what they see. And even more so, the kids that will grow up after 2030, so after the International Space Station is getting decommissioned, that's all they're going to know, because basically astronauts, as we know them, going in the International Space Station to do Earth science experiments, is going to disappear, since there will be no International Space Station, because it's getting decommissioned and there is no plan to replace it. There is a Chinese, space station that is going to be developed, but it's not part of an international, kind of global cooperation efforts, if that makes sense. So, this is kind of like what I find really frustrating, because actually space originally is, if you go back all the way to Neanderthal, or to the origin of, intelligent being Homo sapiens, if that makes sense, we used to use the night sky as guidance or for farming, properties. And so there was like a very different relationship with outer space, which was the one of like perhaps a companion, or something that will expand your imagination, something that will actually find its way into the cave, into the drawings, into, the kind of the formulation of creation. And so that was a much more, I would say, caring relationship between humans and outer space. And then moving on from that, nowadays we have a lot of also science, like, astrobotany, for example, the idea of developing seed, looking at plants in outer space, how microgravity impacts the development of, of a seed, maybe differently, and maybe in a way that, might impact our cultural heritage, for example, that could be found into a seed or into a plant, or, that to me is really interesting as well. Astrobiology, looking for form of life on other planets, or the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, of which I'm a part of as well, like looking for extraterrestrial in outer space. This is really interesting development of space exploration, which is about finding the right frequency by which, intelligence can kind of produce signals, and kind of coming up with a plan as to how we can record this signal that might be coming from outer space as well. So it's kind of like, for me, space is really an opportunity to think outside of the scale and the confine of the Industrial Revolution and the kind of the third wave capitalism that we have, we are into since the 20th century. So it's an opportunity to really think big and think with like much bigger, ideas around frontier, nation states, like kind of put this all aside because it makes absolutely no sense at the scale of the multiverse and the universe that we inhabit. And kind of like start to look at new, perhaps new framework for us to think. And then the other side of that is, being like, obviously, being someone that is fighting for, trans rights and space, and also someone who is queer too. I find that the moon, but also outer space, is also a place for liberation movement and a space for us as well, trans bodies, queer bodies, to also investigate transformation too, in a way that I found really quite exciting in the scope of like, transfeminist, writings and within that kind of like, thinking processes. Yeah.
Absolutely. I love that you say that it had a caring function originally. And personally, every time I go out at night and I'm a bit scared, I always look at the moon and I feel safe. I don't know if it makes sense, but I've always thought, of an outer dimension that is somehow over us and protects us all, and we can play with it as well.
And that's really important to mention as well, because my friend Nadia Tolokonikova, sorry, who is a member of Pussy Riot, one of the co-founder of Pussy Riot. Actually, we did an interview together a while back, and we were talking about obviously every time people interview Nadia, they always ask her about being jailed for like 2 years under Putin, right? And one thing she said is like for her as well, when she was jailed, like the fact that there was a moon, out there outside of a cell is something that like kept her going, because that was the one thing that she could see every day that for her represented freedom. So I think for a lot of oppressed bodies and, people that are, I guess it's quite a lot of us actually, apart from the 1% that somehow found their way into 99% of the media. But I think for a lot of oppressed body, I think the moon still is that space for care, for freedom,
Absolutely. Talking about your movie, because you mentioned it, Doppelgängers, you connect queer identity, intergenerational trauma in a way, and also space exploration. How do these collide for you personally?
So with Doppelgängers, so it's a movie in which I kind of like, I collaborate with my doppelgangers in Algeria and Armenia. And it's, my dad is from Algeria, my mom is from Armenia, but yet I never grew up in Algeria, Armenia. So it's part essay, part documentary, part experimentation, science experimentation, in a way, that film. And so the idea was that so kind of like, I would say, artistic strategy in a way. I will duplicate and I will somehow confront myself with two visions that are similar, but yet, they are this kind of like perhaps fantasy vision of what my life could have been if I was born in Algeria or I had been born, in Armenia. So it was a way to reconcile with my origin quite literally actually. But yet it's a documentary, so it's not like that, and of course, we don't have the same lives. Lucia Gagramanian was the person that was, performing as my doppelganger per se. He's also, an amazing DJ, musicians, and so very much involved in the cultural sector and, and so forth, and kind of looking at the archive, an Armenian archive of music, and trying to like educate the world with it. And then, Miriam Anroun, who is a cultural producer in Algeria, who was playing the role, although it wasn't a role because, of course, it's a documentary of my doppelganger in Algeria, is kind of investigating decolonial practices, across, the arts, for example. And so all of us, we find ourselves into a space mission in which we are tasked to find life and to decide what to do with it, and whether or not we communicate that found that we have made inside this cave, because we have to go in a cave very deep down in the underground. And we have to decide whether or not we communicate to mission control about what we found. And of course, what you find is we kind of question ourselves, and because our parents have experienced the trauma of genocide in the case of the Armenian and the trauma of colonialism in the case of the Algerian, then, is it that we're going to be much more, entitled to like differently about outer space and space exploration than Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos, for example. And that's kind of the premises of the film. And of course, nothing go to plan. And that's what the film kind of like show as well, and it takes you through a journey of like, so you hear from like many different scientists and thinkers and so forth. And the film led to the first paper on intergenerational trauma applied to space exploration. And then it kind of led to the creation of a new session called the Decolonial Practices in Space session at the Astronautical Congress. And then it became like a space for a lot of scholar and thinker and maker of outer space to actually speak about the space in between that are often ignored from mainstream, and yet extremely important because they offer alternative visions that to me are really exciting about what space could be and should be about.
It's incredible. So, it's incredible how, if we stop and think about it, how many versions of ourselves we can live if we were born in a different place at a different time. And as you say, there is the space, obviously, the moon, the universe, the stars, and then there is the space that geographically we inhabit. And it's difficult to make them sometimes, unite. Now you talked about also the fact of, finding a different dimension and the space being a form of cure for people, of protection. And I was wondering, connecting it to the International Space Orchestra, where you turn scientists into performers, what happens to science when it's expressed through music instead of data? And I was thinking also of your project that you did, Piccadilly Unplugged, where basically you broadcasted human heartbeats and unreleased tracks to the moon. And what did this mean to you?
I mean, thank you so much, Chara, for your question as well. I think they're so, I think they really emphasized a lot of like things that are really important, obviously, to the work that I do, but also like to things that I'd like to see in the space industry, right? Obviously, like care, love, compassion, inclusivity, and so, and I think sound and music is a really good way to achieve that. And it turns out that, and you mentioned this project Piccadilly Unplugged, in which in Piccadilly we broadcasted, heartbeats from mothers all around Armenia, and also my family heartbeats, and people that wanted to send their heartbeats as well. We send it to the moon and back, because the moon is like an object at the end of the day, like light. When you project something, you see it because the ray of light kind of come back to your eyes. Same applies to sound too. So if you send a sound into space and you hit an object like the moon, then it's going to come back to Earth, and you need to have a transmitter to receive that. So this is exactly what we did. We did this technology, like this technical moon bounce, where we literally DJ'd with the moon, and we send some signal, and then the moon send it back. And then when it comes back, the sound incorporate statics and incorporate sounds from the Big Bang and the origin of the universe. And it's quite magical, but it sounds horrific. It sounds like completely non-melodic, sounds like static, like and so we broadcasted this from Piccadilly Circus, where people were expecting to hear like really melodic music. And we also had some incredible musicians that took part into this project. So of course, Pussy Riot, who is a long-term collaborator of mine, but Massive Attack as well. Like we had the Avalanches, noise artists like Laulu and Dagger, and some amazing up and coming talents that were looking into again like how it feels to also send music. And then of course these heartbeats that we sent, and so for me it was kind of like a way to also speak about that, like speak about like how we can start reconciling with that aspect of nightlife, but also of space and space exploration, in which we I think there is something quite magical about your mom's heartbeat, or and so I kind of like, even though it might have sounded, I was like, am I really gonna send like my mom's heartbeat into outer space? And I thought that was kind of quite cheesy, but at the same time, it's just very simple and it makes sense to all of us, because we all have a mother, all of us. And so it's really one universal kind of component, one commons that we all have. And I think space is the opportunity to think about the commons in such in such a powerful way. And so, like all of the universals that humans kind of coexist with, like love, peace, compassion, inclusivity, all of these values in some sense, we can kind of like try and like experiment with them or just try and like make them become real. And so that's really exciting. And same for the International Space Orchestra. We get, the head of NASA is playing the gong, astronaut Geiger is playing the percussion.
Yeah.
Everyone is performing, a piece of music together. And there is something quite powerful about all of them trying to be melodic with each other, even though they are at different point of hierarchy inside inside this scientific institution. And so it does facilitate conversation between different bodies. And that's what I'm all about, like critical thinking, being informed within the manufacture of outer space is something that I'm really like trying to develop in all of the project. How can I really support a new manufacture of outer space that is really is going to facilitate critical thinking? I think that's in a nutshell. Critical thinking in the sense of not repeating history and doing something different than, the past 120 years and so forth.
Yeah, it's beautiful and also funny that as scientists, we always try to find answers to questions through data and analysis and so on. But then we still need, as humans, we still need something that, cannot fully be explained like music. And I think that's beautiful, these two components that come together. Talking about education, you founded the University of the Underground to teach students how to modify institutions from within. What's broken, do you think, in traditional education, and what does radical education look like now?
Thank you for your question, Chara. Yes, so the University of the Underground is a charity that we funded in 2017. And it's a collective effort to support free, pluralistic, and transnational education. And by that means that free and free thinking. So like, how can you make sure that education is never feeding into someone's ideology? By that, I mean, you never know when it comes to the educative system, because the educative system, for most of them, are publicly funded. I mean, before they are privately funded. Of course, you have private funding, of course. I think if anything right now, the issue is more that we're starting to have like public funding applied to education that is kind of lacking. But, I think I was brought up to never believe institution, because of the trauma of my family, with that. But but I'd say to you that I've always been fascinated by some concept that Hannah Arendt, the political theorist, has always talked about. She's the person that wrote The Origin of Totalitarianism. She read all of Hitler writing in order to really unpack what totalitarianism mechanics were, and she survived the Holocaust and then went to then teach philosophy and political theory at the New School in New York and so forth. But she's a really interesting thinker in the sense that she says that you should, if you don't want, if you want to avoid totalitarianism, you need to really support plurality. So you need to really develop a platform in which many different minds kind of get together. And for me, this applied to education means that you should never just rely on one source of funding. By that, I mean just public funding, because you never know who is going to be in power. So if you have the case of a Trump or whatever, then suddenly we have the situation where you cannot use the word diversity and you cannot be trans anymore. You cannot use pronouns anymore. You cannot, so an education is just facilitating that. And as a civil servant or as a public, teacher, for example, then you're obliged to follow that. And so that's kind of like the end of free thinking for me. So for me, it was really important to think about like a structure that can exist independently from like public institution, but of course rely as well on public institution. And kind of like have different sources of funding as well, so you can always remain independent, especially if there is issues, and specifically I was interested in citizen funding, the model of the University of the Underground. But then also it was important that it's free to the students, because I think what you see more and more, so especially also in the UK, where I'm based in London, is schools are extremely more and more expensive, and they are just for like the rich few. So how do you make sure that you always have accessibility at the core of like whatever we do? Well, you start to make it free, for example, and it starts there. So that's one of the pillars. Then plurality is what I was explaining to you, is like, how do you bring together all these different minds on the same table to speak about nation states or to speak about a certain topic? So we always try to make sure, whenever we do the University of the Underground programs, is that we hear from people from all over the spectrum. And regardless of what we think as programmers is the right thing to share with the students or not, or whether or not this fall into our line of our thought or not. And so that means that we can put on the same table, like people that are, that are known for having far right, viewpoints, together with people, we have funded, for example, the Black Lives Matter movement, together with people that have funded like movement like Occupy Wall Street, and all of them, together with like a political theorist that has been studying nation states and the development of nation states through history. And then everyone is on the same panel speaking at the same time. And then everyone is talking about nation states, for example. And so that's part of a program called Post-Nation States, for example. And so the students are then able to formulate their own critical mind around each of these ideas without us kind of like trying to tell them, oh, you should be more there or more there, or you should think more this or that, Obviously, this comes with a lot of warning, and and we make sure that the students fully aware that this is also what they will be exposed to. But I think what we find at this point in time in history is like we're so afraid of being challenged in our worldview that we tend to not communicate between each other, and that's part of the issue, the way I see it. So for me, it's really important that there is conversation across all boards. And that can be quite difficult, being honest with you, and it's not always easy as well on a personal level to reconcile with that. And then transnational is the idea that we exist beyond nation states, so we kind of like have different spaces. We do program in Cairo, in the US, we do programs in Taiwan, we do programs a bit like everywhere.
This is amazing, and it connects also to the whole concept of the podcast, which is called Disordinati, which in Italian means messy, chaotic, but in a way that we find a path that, drives us to the right direction. One last question.
But I wanted to say as well about the transnational element that it's, for us, it also means developing federation of support. So we work with a lot of other schools, independent schools everywhere. And so that federation of care, we were talking about care before, is at the essence of the University of the Underground. I mean, right now you have to know as well that we are on pause. Part of it is because there is like a certain fatigue from a lot of us at the moment in terms of community organizing. And so it just takes a bit of time to kind of like, restart but it will find another form, and it will come back to life. So just definitely, like, if your listener want to check out, or sign up to the newsletter of the University of the Underground, like, we will restart program soon.
Yeah, this is amazing. And I mean, meaningful projects always take time. So that's also something to be said. One last question is, if humanity could leave one cultural artifact in orbit, something that truly represents us, what should it be?
Whoa, I wasn't prepared for that question, Shara. I don't know if it should be one thing, I mean, obviously, like, being a pluralistic, like, I would tell you, like, lots of different things, because what do you do with one thing? I think that's kind of maybe part of the issue, is like, we never one thing, we are never really represented by one stuff, like, so, I mean, you could say a bone, you could say, like, an organ, like a heart. I mean, I don't know. I think all of these things are, I don't even know that we should leave anything. I think personally, maybe that's kind of like, maybe what I would say is like, we just need to accept the fact that at the end of the day, we are mortal, and that, something else will come after us. And that's actually really exciting. Like, this kind of notion of new beginnings is of great excitement to me. So I'd love to just see, which is another Hannah Arendt kind of like quite core, if anyone is interested in, like, philosophy, then I'd say like the concept of natality in Hannah Arendt is quite exciting. It's really hopeful. Is that in the dismay of like eradication and totalitarianism, where, obviously the body doesn't think anymore, and the brain doesn't function anymore, and you just follow. a certain mechanics and system, then and an ideology, then what's hopeful in that is the idea that something you can start new beginning. You can actually just the fact of starting something new is a form of resistance and a form of activism. So for me, the idea that we just let it go and we kind of like just support by letting it go, we will probably become like a great resource for new form of life. Perhaps our decay will lead to something different.
Yeah, that's really cool. Nelly, thank you so much for being with me today. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much for the interview, Chara.